This is just a picture of Ferrandino Farm. They are an MDAR and REAP grant recipient in the past. They got a new efficient evaporator and a reverse osmosis machine. So those are some examples of energy efficiency projects that are eligible for the grant. And this is just a brief overview of the grants that are available to farms in Massachusetts. You can see there's obviously the USDA REAP grant. There's also the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture, or MDAR. They have a couple of grants. All of their grants come out in the spring, and I typically do a webinar in the spring that covers those as well as REAP. And finally, there's the Massachusetts Farm Energy Program, which is me. We have a little bit of funding to help farms with projects. Typically, excuse me, typically it's best if our funding comes in as a supplement to other things because it's a maximum of $4,000. So it's not a ton of money, but it can help offset the cost of certain projects. And we also have, Mass Farm Energy Program also provides audit assistance. So if you need an audit or if you want an audit, we are there to help. And we cover 75% of the cost of an audit. So the Rural Energy for America Program, or REAP. Throughout the presentation, I put in some pictures of projects that farms have done that received REAP money, just to give you an idea of what those can look like, and also to sort of talk about our successes. This is Honeypot Farm in Hatfield, a ground-mounted solar array. I would say ground-mounted is not as frequently done as roof-mounted, but it is a possibility. They received about $11,000 from REAP, and then some from MDAR as well. So the first thing everyone wants to know about REAP is how much money can I get? The answer is 25% of your total project cost. So whatever the project costs overall, and for solar that's calculated before you take into account SRECs or any kind of other incentives, you can get 25% of that. So if your project was $100,000, the maximum you can apply for is $25,000. There are two kinds of projects, two buckets that they fit into, either renewable energy systems, which is things like solar, and we're going to talk about this more in detail in just a minute, but anything that you typically would think of as a renewable, solar is by far the most popular. It can also include wind, although that doesn't come up very often, and things like biomass. And then energy efficiency, which is any time that you're improving the efficiency of an existing system. So if you have lights you're going to upgrade, or the maple syrup evaporator that I mentioned, or new refrigeration, anything that's going to use less energy than it was using before, that's an energy efficiency improvement. You can see there's a little bit of difference in what the minimum and maximum grant requests are. For this particular round of REAP in this particular webinar, I'm not going to focus too much on that. Sorry, that went to the next slide for some reason. And I very rarely have anyone whose project doesn't fit into this bracket. It's a pretty wide bracket, and if your project costs less than $1,500, it's probably not worth the amount of time it takes to fill out this application. And I have yet to have one that is $1 million. Most farms in Massachusetts don't exceed that, but because it's a federal grant, this is for everyone across the entire country. That little note at the bottom just says the maximum amount you can apply for is $750,000, which is if you have one energy efficiency and one renewable energy grant in any one year. So that's in any one round of REAP. You can apply across multiple rounds because it's multiple fiscal years. So this round, the fall round, and in fact every fall round, is the restricted round. You're going to hear that or see that. And what that means is just that the projects that they're trying to fund are restricted to those who are costing $80,000 or less. So REAP comes around twice every year, once in the spring and once in the fall. And in the fall, they really try to put the money towards smaller projects, because what can happen, especially in the spring, is you have one project that's huge and that takes up most of the money, and so only a few projects get funded. So in order to make the money go further, they have this restricted round, which is specifically for smaller projects. So you want your project to be $80,000 or less. If your project costs more than that, if you're doing something and you need to get it done now and you can't wait for the spring round, you can still apply, but you can only apply for $20,000. So it's the maximum grant you can get in the fall, regardless of how big your project is. And that's because that's 25% of 80,000, which is the maximum they're shooting for. If your project costs less than 80,000, you can't apply for the 20,000 grant. It still has to be 25% of your cost. This is Mountain View Farm in East Hampton. They did this really nice roof-mounted solar very recently. They got, let's see, $20,000 from REAP. So that would be the max grant for the fall round. But I think they applied in the spring. And so when I talk about total project costs, there are certain things that are eligible and ineligible. It's sort of what you would expect, and this is very similar to the MDAR grants as well. Anything that's ineligible, the biggest thing that comes up is residential usage, especially for solar. If you are putting in a solar project that's also going to give energy to any sort of residence, and that includes like residences for your farm hands or that are on the farm property, it still counts as residential. That's not an eligible cost. So you'd have to sort of tease out how much energy is going to one place or another. I'll come back to that in more detail in a minute. The grant doesn't cover any kind of equipment, so you can't buy a tractor or anything like that. You need to apply and have it approved before you can spend any money or do anything. So if you have already done something, done a project, broken ground, installed something, you want to apply for the grant after the fact, that's ineligible. Any kind of grant writing fees, which you hopefully shouldn't have because the Mass Farm Energy Program provides free grant writing assistance. So if you need help with your REAP grant, come to me and we don't charge anything. And then the rest of those, credit, lease payments, basically anything that isn't part of the project itself. So one thing I do want to mention that's an eligible project cost is a second meter. If you have that situation where you have one meter for solar, you have one electric meter for a residence and the farm for solar, putting in a second meter is a covered cost. So you can apply those costs to your total project cost and get that covered as part of the grant. It does cover anything associated with fees or licenses or things you might need to, break ground or install a thing. And here is, as I mentioned, a list of things that qualify as renewable energy. Solar, again, is the most popular. Most of the people that apply for renewable do solar. Biomass is coming up. I've had a couple people do compost heat recovery, which I want to say falls under geothermal, but might fall under biomass, but it's essentially generating heat from a compost operation. Energy efficiency, again, is sort of self-explanatory. Anything you've already got and you're making more efficient, heating, cooling, insulation. Technology must be commercially available. This hardly ever comes up, but it can't be some new experimental thing. It has to be proven and have warranties and someone to install it. And I think that's it. And then the other thing is who is eligible for REAP. So I'm assuming most of my audience is farms because it's the Mass Farm Energy Program, but REAP is actually available to both agricultural producers and rural small businesses. So an agricultural producer is defined as an entity that receives 51% or more of their gross income from agricultural production. This is going to be determined by your taxes. So you will have to submit taxes as part of this application, and they're going to look at them and see how much of your income comes from farming if you're applying as a farm. There's absolutely no difference in applying as a farm or a rural small business. There's not a benefit to one or the other. It doesn't matter how you get into the program. So a lot of times farms will just apply as a rural small business, either because they don't get 51% of their income from ag or because it's just easier. And it has to be a for-profit small business. If you are a nonprofit, then you have to apply as an ag producer. So you have to meet that 51% rule. You can't apply as a nonprofit small business. And that, again, has to do with the taxes. And you have to be in a rural area. So the rural area is defined by the USDA. They have a map. I've linked to it here. There's a link in the PowerPoint that you can actually click on. But it's essentially a map where you type in your address and it pops up and says this is an eligible area or this isn't an eligible area. And their definition is a city with less than 50,000 in population that is also not contiguous or adjacent to an urbanized area, which would be population more than 50,000. So even if like you are in a rural area, if it's too close to one that isn't rural, that can also disqualify you. And if you are applying as an ag producer, that doesn't apply. You can be right in the middle of Boston, but if you're an ag producer, you are still qualified. And I say that because I actually had a farm in the middle of Boston. Still a farm, still counts. And any kind of business works, so a co-op, private, sole proprietorship, corporation, LLC, those are all fine to count as a business. And so people want to know then what makes it a small business, because you have to be rural and small. That's basically just determined by the size standard. So the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS, N-A-I-C-S, is a code that has, I think, 6 digits over there. You can see on the left there, and I've just taken a screenshot of the document that I used to figure this out. And if you're under the size standard, you're considered a small business. So you have to find your NAICS code on your taxes, which I'm going to show you in just a second. And then you look at this. So it's under $750,000 per year, which most farms in Massachusetts are under that. It's usually not a problem being considered a small business. You can also use an alternative size standard where you're saying that your net worth is less than 15 million and your annual profits less than 5 million. I usually don't have anyone who has to do that because no one is bigger than the size standard. I'm sure it'll happen someday, but it hasn't happened yet. Let's see. I took a little screenshot here. This is what the Schedule F looks like. If you're not a farm, if you're a small business, we'll have to find this number somewhere else. But for farms, it's on your Schedule F. It's a little bit confusing because it doesn't call it a NAICS code. It doesn't tell you what it is. It just says enter code from part 4. But it's right at the top of your Schedule F. So right under where it says profit or loss from farming, it says what kind of farm are you? This was from a tree farm. So I think they grow Christmas trees. And this is the code. And then I have a document that I use to look it up. I've also linked to it in the PowerPoint if you want to look it up yourselves. The codes don't always match exactly, but you can kind of get an idea of where to look in the document. And then it will say, if we go back for just a second, you can see it says soybean farming, wheat farming, corn farming. It kind of tells you what kind of farm you are. If you grow a lot of things, you can kind of pick one. As you can see, most of these have the same size standard, and almost all of them have the same size standard, so it doesn't matter too much. And that's how you know if you are small. Next, I'm going to go through the application itself and tell you all the bits and pieces that you need. This is a lovely picture of Little Brook Farm in Sunderland, who got over half of that solar array you see in the distance there covered between their REAP and their MDAR grant. The components of an application are going to be the actual application packet, which I have and which I'm happy to share with anyone. And then you also need a bunch of attachments. So you basically have to go through and fill out the application and then attach a bunch of other stuff to back it up. So what the USDA wants to know is that everything you've put in your application has some kind of documentation behind it, that you didn't just make it up. And they're trying to basically get at, if we give you this money, will you actually do this project? And will it go all the way through? So they want to make sure you have enough funding for it, you have all your permits lined up, you have a reliable contractor, this stuff has warranties. They want to make sure if you install something, it's going to last for its usable life. It's not going to break in a year and then you won't have it anymore. So some of the things you'll need are a contractor proposal, which has to include a budget breakdown. So not just a flat number that says it's going to cost $20,000, but actually how much of that is for labor, is for equipment, is for site fees, whatever has gone into their budget. And then cut sheets, which is sort of an industry term, but it basically just means the specifications of what you're installing. And most contractors are familiar with that term. So if you say, hey, I need the cut sheets for this cooler, they'll know what that means. You have to have your past 3 years of tax returns, as I mentioned. This is to make sure that you are either deriving enough income from farming or are a small business. You won't get any of these documents back, so anything you submit needs to be a copy. Don't send them your actual tax returns because then you won't have them anymore. You may or may not need an energy audit. We're going to talk about that more on the next slide. And then you see I've highlighted in red commitment of funds. This is the most important thing. It's worth the most points. When we look at the points in the application, you'll see that very clearly. And this basically means REAP's only going to cover 25% of the project. They want to make sure you have the other 75% covered. So you need to document that you can pay for the rest of the project. So either a bank account statement, a loan, another grant that you've got, just something that shows you have the rest of the money. If you're doing a renewable energy project that costs more than $200,000, which for this round, hopefully you won't be, you need a feasibility study, which is a more involved and fancier version of an audit. And you'll also need to submit some supplemental forms. All the supplemental forms are bundled together with the application package right now, but we're going to talk about a couple of them in more detail. And supplementally, you also need an aerial photo, which I usually pull off of Google Earth, but if you have any kind of aerial photo of the plot of land, and a property card, which you can typically get from the town assessors, which basically just says you own this property and this is what it consists of. There's an environmental form that we're going to go over in more detail, but you have to make sure that you're in compliance with all state and federal environmental laws. And then the other thing that can be a hang-up are the federal ID numbers. So you have to have a DUNS number and a SAM code. I'm going to go over each of those in a little bit more detail, but they're essentially federal identification numbers for your business. And the Mass Farm Energy Program is happy to walk through obtaining those numbers with you. They're a little bit difficult to get a handle on because they are a federal process. We did do a webinar about how to get them a couple of years ago, but the process actually changed since then, so that's not super relevant anymore. But I still can share it if anyone wants to see. So do you need an audit? If you're doing energy efficiency, you absolutely do. In order to say that your new equipment is saving energy, you have to have a quantification of what energy you were using, what energy you're going to be using now, how much you're saving. So you have to have an audit. Projects under $200,000 need at least an assessment. The difference between an audit and assessment is just who performs it and how detailed it is. There are a lot of if-then statements in this situation where it's like, if you have this, then you need this, and if you have an assessment, it's this. And I didn't want to go through that all in excruciating detail. So if anyone has a question about that, we can talk about it individually. Again, projects over $200,000 are going to need an audit if they're energy efficiency and feasibility study, if they're renewable. The good news is if you're doing a renewable energy project under $200,000, you don't need an audit. So if you're just doing solar and it costs less than $200,000, you won't have to go through that. The solar contractors provide enough information to supplement the application. The other thing about an assessment is it's typically targeted to one project or a replacement of one piece of equipment. So you're just replacing your cooler. You don't need a full comprehensive audit of the whole operation, whereas an audit would cover your whole farm and all your energy use. And so how do you get one of these? If you need an audit, there's a list of the types of people who are qualified. Generally, they have to be an engineer or have a certain amount of years of experience in doing audits. And I just am using this to plug the fact that the Mass Farm Energy Program will cover up to 75% of your audit cost. So as long as it's a qualified auditor who does it, we'll cover 75% of the cost. This is a cost share, meaning that we pay that directly to the auditor. You don't have to pay it and then be reimbursed. And the cost to farms is typically between $500 and $800. So that's all that you ever have to pay for it, and that goes straight to the auditor. If you get one, you can use it for both REAP and the MDAR grants in the spring. If you get a full Ag EMP, which is an agricultural energy management plan, it's a really comprehensive audit that's also accepted by NRCS. Audits are usually good for about 4 to 5 years, so it's a good investment if you're planning on looking at making improvements in the future. We do have an auditor that we refer people to who's our auditing partner, but you're not required to use them. You can use any qualified auditor, but if you don't know who to go to, we can hook you up. So now I'm going to talk about those federal ID numbers in a little bit more detail. The first one is DUNS, which is a Dun & Bradstreet Data Universal Numbering System. Everything has a really long name. It's a copyrighted proprietary means of identifying businesses. It's basically just a number that says you registered your business as an official business in America. And most farms and businesses that I work with already have one, they just don't know it. It's really easy to find out. You just go online to their website and you put in a request that says, hey, give me my DUNS number, and they will email it to you. If you don't have one, it can take up to 6 weeks to get one. I would say 6 weeks is the maximum. It usually doesn't take that long, and like I said, most people already have one. But it's something that you want to think about right away. If you're serious about applying for REAP, I would say to get these numbers lined up and the process started as quickly as possible. And then I've just taken a little screenshot of what the Dun & Bradstreet website looks like. You can see it says get DUNS number down at the bottom. That's what you click on and it'll take you right there. Once you have the DUNS number, so you can't do this until you have it. Once you have the DUNS number, you can register for a SAM. SAM is short for the System for Award Management. They've also put a little Uncle Sam hat on their logo. I'm sure they did that on purpose. It's sometimes called a cage code or SAM cage code. It's all the same thing. It's another identifying number. The USDA and the federal government in general, but specifically the USDA for this grant, uses this number, first of all, to make sure that you are in compliance with all federal laws. And then it's also how you actually get paid. So when you set up the SAM, you have to put in your direct deposit information. So you need your bank account and routing number and all that. And then if you're awarded the grant, when they pay it, they'll just directly deposit it into that account. It's extremely tedious to apply for this number. It takes a while. It's a two-step process where they have to have you register for an account, then they have to verify that you are who you say you are based on your tax ID number or social security number. And then you have to actually print out a letter and get it notarized and mail it into them. I don't know why, but it's as complicated as it could possibly be. I'm really, really happy to help you guys with this. It's not that difficult. It's just a lot of steps. And also you have to find a notary, which I honestly don't even know where you find a notary anymore, but this can also take several weeks to process. Again, it doesn't usually take 6, but 2 is probably typical. So you want to get your DUNS and your SAM lined up as soon as you possibly can. And I do also want to mention, if you do this on your own, both of these numbers are completely free. It's free to get them. It's free to renew them. You never have to pay anyone for any reason. There's a very common scam going around where people who will have new accounts will get a phone call or an email or even a text from someone saying, oh, there was a problem or we can help you get it, pay us $500. It's absolute nonsense. If you get anything like that or anything seems sketchy, just run it by me. It's probably sketchy. They're really, honest to God, free. They're free to renew. The SAM only lasts for a year, so you do have to renew it every year, but all you have to do is log in and say, yes, all my information is the same. Don't have to pay anyone anything at any time. So this is not a picture of the environmental form. This is a picture of the SHPO form, but these are a couple of supplementary forms that I want to talk about because they're a little bit weird and new. There's going to be an environmental information form as part of the application process. It's different than what it was a couple of years ago. It's essentially a spreadsheet where they're going to ask you to check off that you're not building on a wetland or any other things that are protected by federal law, like endangered species or historic districts or things like that. So you basically just have to fill it out. This is where the aerial map goes. And you're going to have to talk about the size of your project, what impact there's going to be on the environment, are you near any protected resources? And you also have to fill out the SHPO form, which is the State Historic Preservation Office or officer, which basically says that you are not messing with any historic district or building more than 50 years old, and that if you are, you've gotten approval for it. That's what counts as a historic building, something more than 50 years old. This is a very simple form that essentially says, is there ground disturbance? Are you digging anything up? Are you going to mess with anything? And you just fill this out and mail it into the address that's listed right on the top there and get approval. If you don't do this, REAP will do it for you, or the USDA will do it for you. They'll fill it out and mail it in, but that can delay your application. And sometimes it can delay it so much that you don't have that cleared before the deadline or before the REAP people have made their decisions. So you want to get this done ahead of time so that they don't have to deal with it. If you're doing a roof mounted solar that doesn't have any trenching, if you're doing equipment replacement inside a building, you probably don't even need to fill this out because you're not doing ground disturbance unless your building's really old. And you also want to make sure that you know any impacts on roads or rights of way. This is all stuff, again, that I'm happy to go through with people on an individual basis. It's part of the grant assistance that we offer, is to go through your specific case and be like, do you need to fill this out? What do you need to do about it? So I'll help. I'm going to go over a couple of common questions that come up a lot just to try and get those out of the way. This is a very nice, brand new, efficient maple syrup evaporator at Steve's Sugar Shack in West Hampton. They managed to get this entirely paid for through a combination of grants because it was only about $30,000, and they got enough grant money to cover the whole thing, which is possible. So the first question that comes up a lot is, do I have to own the land I do the project on? A lot of farms are renting land or renting a building, and the answer is no, you don't actually have to own it, but you have to control it. So you have to demonstrate a lease agreement that says that it's okay for you to do this project on this land, you have control of it, and the agreement either has to be good for the lifetime of the equipment or you have to take it with you. This doesn't come up a whole lot. Usually the leases are long enough. Long enough that it's not a problem. Typically your lease needs to be more than 3 years and the project must be allowed under the terms of the lease. So I've talked about this a little. What if I only have 1 meter? If you only have 1 electric meter and you're doing a solar project that's going to that's going to supply both the house and the farm, you have 2 options. You can either get an audit, so you can have some kind of assessment saying, 50% goes to the farm, 50% goes to the house, and then you have to sort of prorate the costs of your project accordingly so that you're essentially only asking for enough money to cover a solar array that's sized appropriately to provide only the farm, which I know is sort of confusing, but basically it's just going to be smaller. And it's called a load analysis, where you figure out where the load is going. Any auditor will be able to do that. Or you can just put in a second meter. So you can just have a second meter installed so that you have 1 for the farm and 1 for the residents. And as I said before, that's an eligible cost. Can I build a new structure? Usually the answer is no. There's like 1 very specific case where you can build a new structure. That is if the building is being used for the exact same purpose as the existing building, and based on your energy assessment, it'll be more cost effective to construct a new building and use less energy than improving the existing building. That almost never happens. If you're building a new building where there was never one, that is not eligible. You can build a new building and put solar on the top and apply for a grant to cover the solar, but it will only cover the solar and no construction costs for the building. And this one comes up a lot. Can I submit multiple applications? So there's 2 ways to answer that, and they're both yes. You can submit both a state application in the spring, so you can apply to MDAR, and a federal grant for the same project. Most of the projects I've shown you in the slideshow have done that. It's encouraged, and you should do it. Because one is state money and one is federal money, it's not the same group of money. You absolutely can apply to both. Rather than hindering you, it actually helps because you're demonstrating that you have commitment of funds from another grant source. So yes, apply to both of them. And for REAP, and this has come up a couple of times, you can submit both a renewable and efficiency application. So if you are doing a solar project and also a cooler upgrade, you can submit 1 application for both of those, but only 1 in each round. So you can't have multiple efficiency or multiple renewables. All right, now we're going to go through what you actually get points for. It's not a secret. REAP puts this right out there, how many points everything is worth, so you can try to maximize your points. This is a picture of Red Shirt Farm in Lanesboro, who did this nice roof-mounted solar array. They got almost $11,000 from REAP, and again, covered about half the cost in a combination of grants. So these are the points that a REAP application gets. Basically, everyone starts with 0 points, and they give you points as you meet certain criteria. And it's a total of 100 altogether. The highest score for last fall's restricted round, which was a farm I worked with, was 72. So that's the maximum score anyone in Massachusetts got who applied was 72, and the lowest score was 43. So that's sort of the range you're looking at. I would say 43 is pretty low. We try to shoot for a little bit higher than that. And they basically don't, like I said, keep this a secret. You can tell exactly what you're going to get points for. So the first thing is BTU per grant dollar, which seems like a weird thing to say, but BTU is stands for British Thermal Unit, but basically it's a common denominator to compare all the different types of energy. So in order to compare projects fairly, they convert whatever energy you're saving into BTUs, because if you're saving electricity, someone else is saving therms, someone else is saving cords of wood, it would be hard to compare those. So they convert them all into one type of energy. And they want that to be maximized. So you want to save as much money as you possibly can per grant dollar that they're giving you. Energy replaced, saved, or generated. Let me just look at my note for that. Essentially just means they want to make sure that you've right-sized whatever you're doing. If something's saving a lot of energy under energy efficiency, that's obviously going to score higher than something that's saving less energy. If it is a renewable and it's replacing energy, you want it to be sized correctly to the energy that you're using. So they don't love it when people are doing solar or something that is generating energy to sell back to the grid. It's still eligible, it just won't score quite as highly, but they want to generally make sure that however much energy you're producing is appropriately sized to the size farm that you are. If you have 50 or 100% of your historical usage, you're an energy replacer rather than energy generator because you're just replacing the energy you were already using. Environmental benefits is not worth a ton of points, but it's just saying, is what you're doing going to reduce fossil fuels, reduce carbon output, and be good for the environment, which if it's efficient or renewable, it should be. Then you see commitment of funds. As I said, this is worth the most points. It's worth 20 points. You want to get all 20 of those points. And that's just being able to show, once again, that you can cover the 75% that the grant doesn't cover and that you have documentation for that. So you won't get all the points if you just say, yeah, I can cover it. You have to actually show them you can cover it. You need a bank statement, a loan agreement, a grant offer letter, something that actually shows that. Size, if the ag producer or a small business, you have absolutely no control over this. It's just smaller is better. If you're a smaller business or a smaller farm, then you get more points. There's nothing you can do about that. So you want to try and maximize points where you can. If you're a previous grantee, if you've already gotten a REAP grant, you get fewer points. They give more points to businesses that have never gotten a grant before. Again, you don't really have control over that. The simple payback is how long the project's going to take to pay for itself. So if you're saving X number of dollars and then it costs some number of dollars, it's how many years it's going to take to pay for itself. It's called a simple payback because that doesn't take into account any of the grants or other funding you might get. With grants, paybacks for things are usually very short, but they just sort of look at what the simple payback is. And you'll see a lot of these have that in common, where they're basically trying to maximize the energy savings for the money that they're giving you, and they want to make sure that they do the best work and it's the most efficient. And then there's state director admin points. This is sort of at the discretion of the USDA. The admin points are for underrepresented technology, which is pretty much anything other than solar as far as renewables go. That's an underrepresented technology. Geographic diversity, which is if you're in a town or an area where they've never given a REAP grant before, that gets you more points. If your farm is owned by an underserved population, so a veteran, a minority, or a woman, or underserved populations, those are worth a little more points. And presidential initiatives, I don't know what the current presidential initiatives are, so I have no idea what those points are. But as you can see, this is only worth 10 points, and they're dividing it across all of these different categories, most of which you have no control over. You're either owned by a veteran or not. And the last one is poverty area. The USDA has a map of things that are considered poverty areas. I don't totally know what goes into that because it's a federal designation, but if you're in one of those areas, you can get more points. So this is kind of almost not random, but it's something you have very little control over. So you want to try and get your points where you can with the documents of funds and making sure that the project is a good project that is cost effective and energy effective. Here are a couple of barriers to people getting the grant, things that have come up that have prevented funding. First of all is obviously a low score. If you don't have commitment of funds, if you don't have good cut sheets and documentation, if you don't fill out the application completely, you won't get a good score and you won't get funded. There's a set amount of money, and so only the highest scores get funding. And so sometimes you could just be in a really competitive round and not get funded even though you had a great score, but we try to avoid that. If you have a DUNS or a SAM issue, if you don't have those numbers lined up ahead of time, or if there's some problem with them, that can prevent you from being awarded. If the application's incomplete, if your documentation's incomplete, so if you don't send in everything. Oversubscribed is essentially what I was saying before, meaning there were too many projects and not enough money, which again, you have no control over. If there's not enough commercial usage, so if you do that load analysis and you find that like 85% of your energy usage is going to the farm and 85% of your energy usage is going to your residence and only a little bit's going to the farm, that's not going to fly. The USDA is not going to like that. They don't want to fund residential projects, so it's not going to do well. And if you've already started the project, so if you've already started construction before you get approval from them, that will disqualify you from the grant. So don't do that. Submitting the application. The application must be submitted hard copy, which is annoying, but a fact. Can't email it or fax it or scan it. It needs to be printed out and submitted to a USDA rural office by 4:30 on the deadline date. There are, I think, 4 offices across the state of Massachusetts. If you click on that link in the PowerPoint, it will take you right there and it shows you what all the addresses are. If you have it done before the deadline, I recommend mailing it. You mail it directly to the West Wareham office, because once they're collected at the different rural offices, that's where they go. The USDA has been asking recently for an email version just so they know what to expect, but that won't qualify as your official submission. Once they have it, they'll review it for completeness. They'll give you a receipt via email that says, yeah, we got your application, looks good. And then once they've all rolled in, they'll score them. If you submit it early, and you are encouraged to, you can submit an REAP application anytime that you have it ready. You don't have to wait for the deadline. You could submit it tomorrow if you had it. They might, and the reason that they encourage you to submit it early is because if it's incomplete or they're missing something, they can call you and have time to say, hey, we don't understand this, we're missing this piece of information, help. The deadline for the fall round that we're working on right now is October 31st. Again, this is the restricted round. The deadline for the spring is usually March 31st, in case anyone's thinking about waiting till spring to apply. Last year it was a little later because March 31st I think was a Saturday or Sunday, so it's whatever's the next weekday after that. And then there are some reporting requirements with REAP after the fact. Starting the first full year after construction, for energy efficiency, you have to have 2 years of reporting. For renewable energy, it's 3. I'm not typically involved with projects after they've been installed, so I don't know a ton about the reporting requirements. I would certainly recommend, if you have questions about that, that you reach out to the USDA and ask. They're very helpful. But basically, they're going to want to know if the project is up and working. And I think there's a form you have to fill out. This is Valley Malt in Hadley. They covered more than half of it from a combination of REAP and MDAR grants. And that actually brings me to the end of my slides. That was very quick because I talk super fast. Here's some good contact information. Obviously, that's all of my contact info. I've listed the Mass Farm Energy Hotline there, which rings directly to me. The 2 contacts at the USDA for Massachusetts are Ann Correa and Jonathan Burns, and I've listed their emails and phone numbers. And please let me know at this time if you have any questions. I think I see one in the little chat thing. Okay, the question is, did you say when the grant notification date is? I did not, because they don't have a specific notification date. I will say that this past spring's deadline was, I think, April 1st, which was essentially March 31st, but close enough. And I heard the grant announcements at the end of August, and I think they had gone out to the farm before that, so May, June, July, August, so less than 4 months. So within 4 months from when you submit the application, you should know if you've been awarded the grant or not. There is also the possibility that your application will be unfunded in Massachusetts but go on to compete at the federal level. So what the USDA will do is, once they've distributed all of their money, if they still have applications left, they send them to compete at the federal level, which is all the leftover applications from all the different states. I have yet to have anyone from Massachusetts be funded in that way, but it is a possibility. Do we have any other questions? You got to type them because no one can talk. You guys got any questions? Oh. If you qualify as an ag producer, can you qualify even if you're in an urban area? Yes. If you're an ag producer, you're qualified by virtue of being an ag producer. It doesn't matter where you are. The ruralness is only for small businesses.